Hey guys, my name is Ruben Nathan. In this video, I want to talk about the issue of being pro-life. As you guys know, I am running for Congress, and this is obviously a very much talked about issue. And I guess the Catholic Church just said that they're thinking about denying Joe Biden communion as he is trying to change whether or not government funding can go towards abortion. So this is a very nuanced issue, and like I said, I am pro-life, but the reality of it is we need to get to a bridge where we can do that. I want to start off by saying that there's a lot of people that are talking about the separation of church and state, which that is true, but that separation lies, the burden of that lies on the state, not so much the church. The church can deny Joe Biden communion on their religious beliefs, and that's pretty seamless and easy to do. It's up to the state and the government to change that. With that said, like I said, I am running for Congress and I am running on the Republican ticket in Texas. I am pro-life, uh, but the issue of a lot of this, and opposite to what a lot of people talk about regarding the Bible and this and that, I do not see the issue of pro-life as a religious one so much as a spiritual one. And I'll share my personal belief about it first, and then go from there. Right. So most religions or spirituality sectors will say that we are not our temporal body. We're not the body that we live in. We are the observers. Right. No matter what God you believe in, we all come from the same one. And so, from that standpoint, because energy cannot be created or destroyed, in my personal spiritual or religious belief, if someone does have an abortion, it just the energy would just be rerouted somewhere else. As I said, we're not the chemical body or the pain body. So that's my spiritual personal stance on that. If you see on Ballotpedia, it says Christian mystic, and I guess that kind of goes into that. With that said, though, I do see the issue of pro-life as a constitutional one because the Constitution says you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so I think it's interesting that so many people frame the issue of being pro-life as a religious issue because it really seems like a constitutional issue to me, being that life is the primary guarantee or right of being an American citizen. It seems that that right would be constitutionally protected from the point of conception. And so, with that said, my solution for the abortion issue, and although I am personally against abortion, my goal is to bridge to that place versus banning it because it's not a zero sum game. And what I mean by that is just because I don't believe in abortion and because it's unconstitutional does not mean that it's not going to happen or that people will no longer engage in sexual relations or just not get pregnant. And so, with that said, I also understand that banning abortion outright is an undue burden as it was ruled by the Supreme Court. And so, just because it's a constitutional protected right doesn't, as I read it and in my view, doesn't mean that it's also not an undue burden. Meaning that if we were to say in Texas that we're just going to ban abortions, the undue burden kicks in with someone getting pregnant and then driving to Oklahoma or to Florida or to California or what have you and get an abortion anyway, right? And so because it's not a federal ban, and even if it was a federal ban, they can go to Mexico. I mean, the thing is, if someone's going to have an abortion, they're going to find a way, right? If they don't want to have a child, they're going to find a way. And so, my view with dealing with this would be to, if you know anything about the LGBT community, we have something called a PrEP or pre-exposure prophylaxis, which essentially it's a preventative care measure in which you take a pill and it basically blocks you from the ability of acquiring HIV. And so, with that, I want to propose the following question, right? If you are pro-life on the jurisdiction of religion, then is the goal to criminalize someone for having an abortion, or is the goal to bridge to a point where abortion is no longer a conversation or an issue? Because if you're like me, I want to get to the point where abortion is no longer a conversation or an issue, right? Because quite frankly, by the time we get to talking about whether or not we can have an abortion or if an abortion should be legal, in my opinion, it's already too late. Meaning that, if you are religious, if you are spiritual in any way, shape, or form, or even if you're very big on science and, in the first principle method, there is being reactive and there's being proactive. And when you are being proactive, you are essentially living your life or moving in a way by which certain things just wouldn't come up because you are being preventative or protected. Not to say that accidents don't happen, right? But then the margin by which they would is significantly less. And so with that, I because if you look at the issue of having an unwanted pregnancy in general, right? If it ends up falling on the state anyway, and so for that reason, I do believe we may as well front run the situation, meaning that we invest heavily in preventative care. And I also, my biggest thing on this is shifting the burden of proof, meaning that a lot of my issue and where I do agree with a lot of the Democrats or the left side of this is that a lot of times women are just left to their own devices in terms of handling the issue. And so I believe, and this is also where I do believe in cutting down bureaucracy on the Republican side, where in my view, the best way to handle this is to shift the burden of proof to the father, meaning that if a woman gets pregnant and she says he is the father, instantaneously something very seamless to do, something that I think should be on the technological side very easy to do, is file like a quick claim that so and so is the father of a child, and immediately that would register into a federal or a state level jurisdiction or government entity, right? In that moment, instantaneously, the woman, the pregnant person in question, would immediately be the one to then get the checks of the person first, meaning that child support would be immediately taken out of the check of the father in question and immediately rerouted to the mother. And so what this would do is then it's up to the father to prove that it's not his baby. And so with that, I would then shift the the method of going about this. And so then the mother, upon having the child, would have the father could contest that again electronically, instantaneously. I am not the father, contested. And then the mother would have, let's say, 2 weeks to a month, and then maximum would be like 3 months, where you go take a paternity test under a clinic or something that is in conjunction working with the government, meaning that you don't know the doctor or whoever, right? And so then you take the paternity test, by which if it comes out that he is in fact not the father, then the canceled check would revert back to the original member or the father. Second, what I would do is that if the father is not working, which is so often the case, or working under the water, then the government would uh, force the father in question at this point to, and again in Texas this is kind of a thing, right, where you work building bridges or what have you, some sort of, okay, if you don't have a job, then you're going to clean the bridges and the roads or some community service, by which then out of that uh, the mother would get that check, right? And so meaning that if the government would then pay like $10 an hour, 15 or what have you, then the appropriate designation of that would go to the mother out of the community service that the father is doing. And so what this would do, and really the purpose for this, is that it would disincentivize fathers from working under the table or under the water to not have to pay child support. And so finally, if the father is a minor, which is so often the case where they're 16, 17 years old, then the same clawback applies to the parent, meaning that the father's parent in this case would be responsible maybe for like half or a quarter if it's both parents involved, right? The mom's parents and the father's parents. But nonetheless, there would be the same clawback that applies to the guardian of that minor. And the goal for this is not so much to penalize the parent, right? But rather that if he is a minor, the parents would then feel that they themselves would have to uh, force the son, or not necessarily force, but essentially it was strongly encourage the child to get a job while going to school. And the purpose for that is so that we don't fall into a system where this a tolerance for parental negligence on behalf of the father. And what this would also do is incentivize the father, in this case a minor, to get a better job and continue to go to school, meaning that they will not fall by the wayside because there is a parent that is front running the responsibility of the father, giving them the 1 or 2 years to have to work to make up for what the parent is paying. And thus, by the time that they are in 18, they are already of the mindset and the mind frame to continue to work or to get a better job, right? So it's essentially bridging to the point where we do get to where people would not have abortions. We would get to the point where there is a societal responsibility and awareness acknowledgement that just like you wouldn't want to get HIV, going back to the preventative care in the HIV community or in the LGBT community getting PrEP, you would treat an unwanted pregnancy to the same degree, because there is a burden that you are being held accountable to, and not just making it the mother and the government's responsibility. And so, finally, going back to the previous statement that I made regarding uh, the government assistance, because unwanted pregnancies do ultimately end up falling on the state in one way or another, whether that is public schooling or healthcare or anything like that. I do believe that front running preventative care and making Plan B pills accessible and maybe even anonymous, um, as well as a birth control and vasectomies, mind you. Uh, and this is something that I think is probably more controversial, but if you're in America, as far as I understand, and you have a boy, the circumcision is free, and so, or it's covered or something like that. And so, what I do believe is that not only is that inhumane, but that's a different conversation. But deferring that credit to a vasectomy, meaning that rather than you have a boy, rather than getting the circumcision, you can defer that credit or that, so that when they're 14, 15, 16, 17, because it's reversible, mind you, this is why I say that. They can defer it to that point, and again, because it's reversible, that can always be reversed. And so, again, the point for this is incentivizing people to get to the point where we do not have to have an abortion conversation, because we're front running prevention so much. I do also believe in free condoms. I know that a lot of the Republicans don't agree with me on this, but again, it goes back to, is the goal really to get away from prevention because of actually their predominantly sincerely held beliefs, or is it to criminalize the mother? Then again, at that point, we're going to undue burden. And finally, I want to talk about the point that people say, like, is it murder or not? And again, when a baby goes through the developmental stages, right? It is an infant, and then it's a child, and it's a preteen and an adult, right? Same with people say, like, what's a fetus? Well, yeah, that's the developmental stage of that baby in that condition. Now, the what I would say is that I am pro life, and I am against any kind of abortion, really, after the first 3 months, unless it's life threatening or what have you, which I think nobody would argue that. Um, Other than that, like I said, I believe it is an issue of a constitutional right, not a religious one, where they are entitled to life. And murder, I think, as dramatic as it sounds, to willfully terminate someone's life, who, if you even go by last year, who would likely not have their life terminated should event not transpired, right? We heard that a lot last year. Well, they would still be alive if XYZ event didn't transpire. So it is still murder. I think the same logic applies here, right? If the baby wasn't aborted, or the fetus or what have you wasn't aborted, would they likely be alive a year later, right? I think, again, of reasoning, black and white. I think the truth is always simple, seamless, and it just is, right. It is the lies that we tell to subvert the truth that become complicated, politically polarizing, and complex. And so, again, I am pro-life, but in the same respect, I understand that the undue burden, and it's not zero sum. And I think if you are against abortion from a religious standpoint, or from a murder standpoint, then you want to genuinely prevent this from happening, right? Not just a talking point, but as a general concern. And I think to do that will ultimately be much more beneficial to engage in front running preventative care, because we end up paying for it anyways. Uh, Making Plan B accessible. And again, this is going back to the undue burden, would I think, whether there's a heartbeat the next day, I think is much more nuanced than 3 months later, right? So it's about getting to those solutions because, as theoretically interesting as it may be to just say ban abortions, people are not, it's unrealistic. People are not going to stop having sex. And so, but moving into a culture that, it takes a village to raise a child, and going to a culture where everyone shares their responsibility and is very cognizant of responsibility. Part of the issue, I believe, is that a lot of times it is the male, right, that tends to be the one that has much more drive to engage in the sexual acts more often than not. And so I believe that the responsibility of the consequences should be equal weighted to the degree by which they can evade the responsibility. And so for that reason, I do believe that front running the responsibility to the father, and really, I think anyone would agree it's the right thing to do, right? Why have such bureaucracy about disputing the who is the father, who isn't the father, and all of that, and having a lawyer and all of these things, when you can simply just, and not to mention that it would probably incentivize more united households. It would disincentivize fathers from, or men from running away from responsibility or engaging in negligent sex or even rape or anything like that, knowing that, you know there is going to be a possibility that the burden of proof is going to be against their favor, right? And in that sense, it would shift accordingly. And I think, honestly, I believe that if we shifted alone, it would have a dramatic, because let's be honest, I think intuitively speaking, I think younger men especially have a natural predisposition to emotional avoidance, to being non-committal, which is honestly what a lot of the religious points is, right? It's that commitment, is that being a strong masculine figure. Honestly, that's really the point across the board, that we need more fathers and what have you, and treating that accordingly from the inception point, which is, the moment in which you decide to engage in this sexual act. Know that if any consequence comes out of it, not evaded by saying, "Oh, I'm just not going to work." That's why I say it's a bridge. I wouldn't have abortions anymore, because eventually people will be cognizant the same way that the LGBT community is cognizant of HIV, right? You know that if you slip up, you are going to have 18 years of consequence thereafter. And then, of course, having a much more aggressive criminal penalty for rape, for anything of that nature across the board, for evasion of responsibility, some sort of even consequence for that. But like I said, we cannot allow people to just keep running away from the responsibility, or just not work, right? So again, if a father wants to decide that they're not going to get a job because, well, it's going to child support, well, then you're going to pick up trash and you're going to do community service. And if they don't have a job, then we can make 40 hours of community service for the government to cut that 500 $1,000 check. Collectively responsible as a village, it takes, then we would get to the point where this becomes a non-issue, because we're more cognizant of the responsibility. I think I have so much compassion for and love for the left side of the aisle, because I do think this to be more empathetic. But in the same respect, I think bad actors tend to creep in, methods of self-degradation, that allow for their own empowerment, right? Going back to the post, it seems to me that the leader of the set chaos they created, in that sense. So with that said, I love you guys. Thank you so much for watching this, and I'll see you guys on the next video.